Salem's Lot by Stephen King. So it is October, Halloween is upcoming, and you know we had to talk about the King at some point. Stephen King, the maestro of horror. This was his second published book, published, I believe, in 1975, and it is coincidentally the way that I was actually first made aware of who Stephen King was. I remember a very vivid memory because it's the first time you ever see your parents display fear. It sticks with you. I believe I was like 8 or 9 years old, and they aired on television a commercial for a replay of that old Salem's Lot miniseries that they made that Toby Hooper of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre fame actually made back in the 1970s. And when that commercial came on, I remember my mother was like, "No, no, no, turn it off, don't watch that." And I was like, what's wrong?" And she was like, "That's some scary stuff. You don't need to watch that." And I was like, "Oh, I'm intrigued now." And she went on to explain how that miniseries terrified her as a young girl back in the 1970s when it came out. She apparently lived at that time in a house that had like a closet or something that looked a lot like where the vampires come out of in the miniseries, and that every night after watching it, she would like fall asleep with the covers up to the eyes, just trembling in fear of the vampires coming out of the closet or something like that. But anyway, that was how I was first introduced to the name of Stephen King. It's a very striking first time your parents exhibit fear around you. But I knew after that I was going to have to read this book someday just based on that. And I actually read it last year as a lead in to my read through of the Dark Tower series because this book ties in very prominently to the Dark Tower. In fact, it is perhaps the most prominent tie in of all of his other works. Not only does it have a character that appears in the series from Salem's Lot, but the book itself actually plays something of a role in the series. I won't spoil it. If you've read it, you know. Very interesting, very meta. But so I had to read it just to get to the Dark Tower. And you know what? Salem's Lot is not a very good book. Okay, so to get this out of the way up front, if you thought this was going to be some kind of glowing, positive review in which I lavish praise upon Stephen King, this ain't that. There are enough Stephen King fanboys on YouTube who will heap praise on the man's work and pretend that every word that he has ever written is pure gold. I ain't one of them. I take a much more critical eye to Stephen King because he is not the flawless master that so many people think he is. I at one time thought that too, but them days is gone. So when I read Salem's Lot, I was kind of surprised at how poor it actually was. So join me as I critique and review Stephen King's Salem's Lot. So, what is Salem's Lot about? Well, it concerns a town in Maine. There's always a town in Maine because Maine in the Stephen Kingiverse is the most haunted and gnarly and supernatural state in the Union. In fact, if any of Stephen King's works were actually factual, I think that would make a good case for Maine being nuked off the face of the planet. But there's a town in Maine called Salem's Lot, which is actually short for Jerusalem's Lot. When I first read this, I thought Salem. I thought it was going to be like Salem, Massachusetts, with the witch trials and everything. But no, this is actually a shortening of the word Jerusalem. So Salem's Lot is a town in Maine, and returning to this town is an upstart young writer. Because again, there's always a writer, isn't there? Just like with so many other of Stephen King's books, the protagonist in Salem's Lot is an author, much like Stephen King himself. The author is named Ben Mears. He is returning to Salem's Lot after many years in order to write a book on the Marston House, which is a creepy old house on a hill, which is apparently haunted and in which he had a traumatic experience in childhood involving the specter that apparently inhabits said house. And it turns out that this house has just recently been purchased by a man named Kurt Barlow and his partner Straker. They are in the antiques business ostensibly. But wouldn't you know it, Kurt Barlow is actually a vampire. And the people of the town of Salem's Lot slowly begin to be turned into vampires themselves. Gasp. And so Ben Mears, along with Susan, who is the young, I think she's like a college student who he strikes up something of an insta love romance with, as well as some more of their acquaintances, have to rise to the occasion to become the fearless vampire killers and hopefully save the town. So that's the overview of the plot. And if you don't want the whole book spoiled, leave now because I'm going to spoil it because that's going to lead into some of my critiques. So to get the positives out of the way, um, yeah, the stony silence kind of says all. There's not a lot that I can say positive about Salem's Lot other than like it's fairly entertaining, kind of. I mean, it is pretty entertaining. I was never bored reading it, so I guess it succeeded on the most basic level. But beyond that, there ain't really a lot that I can say in this book's defense. So moving on to the critiques. First of all, um, the characters in this book are vastly weaker than what Stephen King would later come to write, and that really surprises me, or surprised me at the time I read this book. It really surprises me to even hear myself critique Stephen King based on character because whatever faults the man may have as a writer, and he does have a lot, character is almost never one of them. The way that he writes characters and develops characters are very, very human, very, very flawed, very, very well rounded, actually. And that's why, if out of all the popular fiction authors alive today, Stephen King, I think, hands down, has the best characters. But not so in Salem's Lot. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Stephen King did not really hit his stride until his third book, The Shining. That's the one where all the real Kingisms uh, came into play fully. Carrie and Salem's Lot were kind of the beta runs, I think, and they're noticeably, or at least Salem's Lot is noticeably weaker in terms of character. The characters in Salem's Lot are honestly pretty thin. And again, that's kind of shocking to say that because I would almost never complain about that in any other Stephen King book or almost any other. But these characters just aren't that great. They're not that memorable. Ben Mears is a decent protagonist, I guess. He is your typical Stephen King hero. He's an author, of course. He's kind of snarky and uh, kind of kind of douchebaggy in a little in some ways because most of Stephen King's protagonists kind of have a snarkiness to them. But Susan, his love interest, is decent as well because there's a conflict between her and her mother and stuff that kind of lets us see into her outlook a little bit. They're okay, but the rest of the characters in this book are not that great. There's a teacher and a doctor, I believe, neither of whom I can remember. There's a kid named Mark. Um, there's just not much to remark upon of the characters in this book. And that leads me into the second criticism. Stephen King spoils this entire freaking story on page one with that prologue that is so needless. The Salem's Lot opens with a prologue that takes place after the story has concluded. Almost the entirety of the book is like extended flashback. The prologue opens in Mexico with a man who is only referred to as the tall man and a boy. Well, when you figure out that Ben Mears is kind of tall and that there's only one character in this story who is a young boy, and that's Mark Petrie, well, then you kind of figure out who lives and who dies since none of the other characters in this story appear in the prologue. There's not much suspense. I knew exactly who was going to live and who was going to die, and that irked me because this prologue serves no freaking purpose whatsoever. You could cut that prologue out and just start with chapter one, and it would be a much stronger book. But Stephen King, apparently not knowing what he was doing, at least not at that point in his career, ruined the whole story on literally page one, and it was downhill from there. So already right out the gate, we know who's going to live and who's going to die. Um, and it that was a big mark in this book's disfavor. So Kurt Barlow is a vampire, and the vampires are the main menace of this book. Also, Stephen King, this book plays very hard into the old traditional notions of the vampire. There is no attempt on Stephen King's part to tweak the formula or reinvent anything. That is to say, these vampires are basically taken right out of Dracula and European folklore. Kurt Barlow literally sleeps in a coffin. Crosses and garlic are deadly. They can't come out in sunlight. Also, they can't enter anybody's home without explicit invitation. I would have you remark that because that leads me into a major criticism of this book, which is the glaring plot hole that exists in its center. But so Kurt Barlow is a vampire. He starts feeding off the townspeople and turning more of them into vampires. And Ben and his ragged band of cohorts has to rise up to fight the vampires. Except all of them die except Ben and Mark, the young boy. At one point, Susan, Ben's love interest, gets bitten and she turns. And so there's this scene where he has to stake her because, again, the classic stake through the heart. He has to stake her in order to re-kill her because she's now one of the undead. And that entire scene was set up to be like this heart-rending, oh no, this man has to drive a wooden wedge through the heart of the woman he loves. And I like, it was supposed to be touching and kind of, get you right in the feels. It did not. It was corny. I did not care. I was just like, please, let's just move on. Stake this bitch and let's go. And it falls flat in an emotional sense as well. So that leads me again as to the major criticism that I alluded to, uh, the plot hole. So in this book, in keeping with the folkloric legends of the vampires from European mythology, uh, vampires cannot enter your home unless they are invited. That is just one of the old legends. You have to invite them in. As with most, if you'll notice, as with most evil things in either mythology or in some religions and stuff, you have to invite them in. They can't touch you unless you allow them to. And Stephen King plays right into that. The vampires in this can't come into people's houses unless they invite them in, except for the climactic fight between Kurt Barlow and Father Callahan, who is the character who carries over into the Dark Tower series, who is actually perhaps the most interesting character in this book, the alcoholic priest. That sounds like something out of a Graham Greene book, and maybe Stephen King was actually drawing on some of Graham Greene's work when he thought of that character. But Father Callahan is actually kind of an interesting character, and sadly, he's barely in the book, but hey, points where they count. But anyway, so in the climactic showdown between Father Callahan, the drunken priest, and Kurt Barlow, the master vampire, Kurt Barlow breaks into Mark Petrie's house through the skylight. I don't know about you, but that would strike me as a violation of the you can't come in unless you're invited rule, which has been adamant up until that point. I don't, Stephen King, I don't really think you knew what you were doing yet when you were writing this book. But yeah, I think that's a plot hole. It struck me as a plot hole. I was like, did you not put any thought into that? Like, they can't come in because there's a scene earlier where Mark, the young boy, is after Susan gets turned into a vampire and she's outside his window and she's like, "Come out, Mark, come out," and because she has to lure him out or he has to invite her in, and he doesn't do it, and he just holds up the little cross and she flies away or whatnot. Um, that was made it pretty clear how the rules worked, and then you just broke that rule when the main vampire just breaks into the dude's house. It's just, what were you thinking? You weren't thinking, apparently. because you broke your own rules. So this story is fundamentally broken at the most basic level because you couldn't even keep the rules straight. It's like the movie Tenet. It sets up all these rules only to break them. So in addition to that, the writing in this book is pretty bad. And that's saying something because Stephen King's books are so often so poorly written. Uh, but Salem's Lot really takes it to a new level. There is an attempt early on in the book. I'd have to try to go back and find it, but there's an attempt, and if you've read the book, you'll probably know there's an attempt of Stephen King's to make some kind of grand, profound metaphor involving the words something turned like the millstones grinding some unknown bread or something like that. I will just always remember the phrase some unknown bread. What the hell does that even mean? Stephen King, this book is just, it got away from you in virtually every way. The writing is crap. He tries so hard to bring all of the townspeople into this book as separate characters, and it just does not work. You are not going to make somebody care about a character when they only have one paragraph of exposition setting up who they are. Not going to do it. He brings in almost, or perhaps dozens of the townspeople of Salem's Lot as minor characters, and like some people are having an affair, or some people are like I don't know, it's just small town drama. And he writes these stupid lines like the town held its darkness, the town knew its darkness. I'm just like, Stephen King, stop. This is painfully cringy writing. The townspeople, you don't care when they get turned or when they get sucked dry because they're just names on paper. It would have been better had he just not tried that, and it would have cut down a lot on the length of this book because this book is longer than it needs to be, I think. Also, it's not very violent, which that's not an objective critique because I think books can and probably are scarier when they go for the subtle route, but subtlety is not in Stephen King's book. And so you're kind of wanting there to be some good gore in this book. I mean, it's about freaking vampires. At least show us some people getting their necks ripped open or something. But it's not very violent. It's kind of anemic, really, and a pun intended because it involves blood. But it's not very violent, and so it's just kind of bland and forgettable. And that brings me to the internal logic of this book. So by the end of the book, and as I said, I'm going to spoil it, so leave now if you're still here and not wanting it to be spoiled. At the end of the book, they lose. Everyone dies except Ben and Mark, and they hightail it to Mexico, which is where this dumbass prologue picks up. And the entire town, literally the entire town of Salem's Lot, is turned into vampires. And there are like mentions of like articles in newspapers saying, where did all the citizens of this town go? Well, this town is like a ghost town now. Like, what? There are so many logical problems with that. Now I can understand that if this book took place in like 1600 something or 1700 something, like back in the classical era of the vampire myth in Europe. I could understand that if you had like a small village of like 200 people that just all turned into vampires. I could see that. But this takes place in modern day, or at least mid 20th century America, and that shit just doesn't fly. So if you have an entire town of people who just magically vanish, like the Roanoke colony, you're going to have inquiries. Do none of these townspeople have relatives that wonder what happened to them? Do the banks and like the IRS not have any stake in the taxes and mortgage payments that they're not going to be collecting out of the now undead townspeople? Like, does the U.S. government not find, or at least the government of Maine, not find it a tad odd that an entire town of thriving, living people just turned into a ghost town overnight? What the hell? There's no way that you can bend that to where it works in a realistic fashion with the setting and the context of this book. It just don't work. This book is fundamentally stupid at its heart as well. And so that brings me to my rating of Salem's Lot. It's pretty low. I would give this at best a C minus, I think, and that's being generous. It's a C minus teetering on the edge of like a D. The only thing that I can say truly positively about Salem's Lot is that it was in Stephen King's early days, and he was much more restrained in those early couple books, Carrie and Salem's Lot. Again, The Shining is where he really just came right out. And when I say restrained, I mean that, of course, in the love scenes, because so many of Stephen, actually virtually all of Stephen King's later books would just veer into just straight up pornography, very uncomfortable pornography. The Stand, I'm looking at you, The Stand, that book was so porny and so needlessly porny. But Salem's Lot is a little bit more restrained, and so the one love scene in this book is much more tactfully handled. If the dialogue is a bit wooden, it at least was a little bit more not quite so needlessly explicit, but that's pale praise really at this point. Salem's Lot's not a very good book. Again, barely a C minus, but I know there are a lot of Stephen King fanboys out there who will probably, who can, or if not will, come for my jugular, another pun, up in arms, saying, "How dare you not see and how dare you not recognize the majesty of Salem's Lot?" No, Stephen King has hit some really good highs in his career. Pet Cemetery, Misery, those books are stone cold horror modern classics. Salem's Lot is not one of them. It is a poorly conceived and poorly executed book, start to finish. Needless prologue that serves no purpose other than to eliminate any sense of suspense or urgency. Thinly written characters that do not come alive like the characters he would later portray in other books. Very poor writing, and that's really saying something. Again, very poor attempts at metaphor and profundity. Um, Gaping plot hole involving the rules of what the vampires can and cannot do, and of course the dumbass logistics of how this entire town could just vanish and nobody apparently cared. It's not a good book. Salem's Lot, wouldn't recommend it. I just did this review because it's October and I had to talk about at least one Stephen King book. And you know, anytime I get a chance to rip Stephen King a new asshole, I'm gonna take it. So Salem's Lot, crap book, barely C minus, if that. Have you read Salem's Lot? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it. Um, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said here today. Oh, I know there are a lot of people that are going to disagree with what I've said, but I don't really think you can argue the points that I've made because it's pretty ironclad, I think, with the criticisms, because it just doesn't hold together. But if you haven't read Salem's Lot, I'm not going to recommend this unless, like me, you want to read The Dark Tower, which is a much loftier and much better work. If you're going to read The Dark Tower, this is a prerequisite, because you basically have to, or else you're not going to understand certain things later on in The Dark Tower, or at least not as well as you will if you read this. So if you want to pursue The Dark Tower, read this. If you don't, you ain't missing anything. So as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to like, subscribe, help the channel out a little bit. I would greatly appreciate it. And until next time, peace.